Thank you so much, everyone. Some very worrying stories coming from Kano State. We hope at some point on the program we will get some clarity and some information from the governor on the program tonight. But let's get to talk about some other issues for tonight. President Muhammadu Buhari will obviously miss his late chief of staff, Malam Abba Kyari, after he died over the weekend due to complications from coronavirus disease. As of now, there hasn't been any news on a replacement for Malam Abba Kyari, the late Abba Kyari. That office is still, there's still a vacuum. A lot of people have been talking about the consideration for the next chief of staff. Analysts are also talking about how strategic and key the running of the office of the president is to the office of the chief of staff. The president says there hasn't been any vacuum since the past weeks, since Malam Kyari was hospitalized before his death. Tonight, we assess the task before President Muhammadu Buhari and the essentials or the duties of the office of the chief of staff. I'm being joined tonight on the program from our Abuja studio by Mr. Kasim Afegbua. He's a public affairs analyst and the former spokesperson of the PDP Presidential Campaign Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Afegbua. And also have a lawyer and a member of the Lincoln's Inn, London, also a social affairs commentator, Mr. Daniel Bwala. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming on tonight. Let's begin to analyze and look at what Nigerians are expecting, especially what would come out as an enormous task on the hands of the president, replacing someone in the caliber of Malam Abba Kyari. First, about the kind of education he has, his background, and of course, the closeness Mr. Abba Kyari had with President Muhammadu Buhari. Let me begin with you, Mr. Daniel Bwala. Just how massive will the gap Malam Abba Kyari left in the presidency, especially as the chief of staff? How big is that gap?
Well, my condolences to the family of late Malam Abba Kyari, to the president and to Nigerians over the days of the former chief of staff. The office of the chief of staff, peculiarly with the president or to the president of the Federal Republic, is different from the role chief of staffs play in other jurisdictions because everyone has his own style. In the case of Nigeria, the president has sort of have extreme trust in the person of the chief of staff, the office of the chief of staff, not necessarily the person. So even though he is not here today, but whoever the president anoints or appoints as the chief of staff, it is expected that the same power that he placed on the office or in that office will also be extended to the person. And when we look at the style of the president and the way the former chief of staff had operated, I know that I can have an idea of the qualities that will be required in the person who will be the next chief of staff in the government. And especially because there must be improvement in what you do. So the key component, which was not with Malam Abba, the late Malam Abba Kyari, is background in intelligence. The person who will become the chief of staff must have a background in intelligence. The reason is because Nigeria has assumed a kind of problem that is, assuming monumental proportion. We have insecurity problem, we have economic problem, and here we are with a pandemic issue. And so somebody with a background in intelligence will better serve the office of the president, managing the office as the chief of staff. The second thing is the person must also be manager of men and machines because of the complexities of that office, because the chief of staff, apart from answering to the president, on behalf of the president also coordinates the activities of governors of various states, as well as ministers and security chiefs. And so having background from intelligence and then knowing how to manage men and machine is key. He must also be somebody that is bold and frank with his principle. It is not a sycophant that the president will require in that office. It must be somebody that will be able to look at the president respectfully and carefully, canvas points that he believes are very vital and important in the management of the country because of the trust that the president placed on him. And one important component, he must also be somebody that is hated by men, but appreciated or loved by his principal. If you bring to that office somebody that everybody loves, that is a clear sign that you're disqualified, because the office of the chief of staff and the villa must not be a museum where every Tom, Dick, and Harry assembles there. So he must be somebody who, because of his loyalty to the president, lots of people who do not naturally or personally like the president are not going to like him, like in the case of the previous one. Because so many people who didn't like the president have had to find him as one that would take bullet on behalf of his boss. So there are many other components that the president may want to look at in the person he will appoint as the chief of staff. But very importantly and very, very powerfully must be that knowledge and background from the intelligence platform. Because if you have noticed, Seun, just before the end of last year, there was these rumors flying up and down that the late chief of staff had had meetings with security chiefs and army chiefs with regards to fighting insurgency and all that. And so that is the power delegated to that office, because the president does not want pressure. He is somebody who is known, and his characteristic and style of leadership is to delegate. So that person who will now occupy that office must be somebody who comes from that background, so that he will understand, in a nutshell, in his conversation, in the coordination of that office, and interrelationship of the various security and law enforcement intelligence of the government.
I was going to ask you, before I bring Mr. Afegbua into the conversation, just briefly, do you also think that such a person you're describing should be a key political figure in the APC, the ruling party, of course?
The person should not be one who has run for office or he's running for office in the political sphere. It must be a professional from the security background, who has served or who has managed architecture of the government, who has operated in an area of government that helps him to appreciate, in a nutshell, the workings of the government. If the president picks a politician, say somebody who has run for office or somebody who is running for office, that office of the chief of staff is likely going to be clogged by political consideration and political activities there. So he needs somebody who is professional, thoroughbred, and trained in that field, so that that person will better manage the office of the chief of staff going forward.
Mr. Afegbua, please come into the conversation. You have been in government. You know what it means to have a chief of staff. It's a kitchen cabinet member of the president's office. And so it may not be constitutionally captured, but in essence, what are your expectations? And if you also maybe want to react to what Mr. Bwala said.
Well, thank you very much, Seun. I think I just get worried when I hear rhetorics like the president's style. I don't know what kind of style we're talking about here. I think we should talk more about the person of the president. He's not a leader that has his hands on the jar of leadership. He's not one that is caught for taking quick initiatives or proactively engage the polity when problems stare us in the face. Even in the wake of this COVID-19, it was almost like pushing the president on the butt before he could address Nigerians. So I am looking at a chief of staff that will be much younger than the last one, number one, that has a broader and wider perspectives about the intricate logic of the Nigerian Federation, understanding the geopolitics of the country, so that when he's about to give advice, because he's the advisor-in-chief, when he wants to give advice to his president, to his principal, he will be giving it from the point of view of understanding of the dynamics in the country, and not necessarily what the president will want to pander to. I don't want to be bogged down by this scenario that, okay, he has to be loyal to the president. He has to be. What is key is delivering the promises that the president makes to the country, being able to also understand the issues in polity, not necessarily somebody from an intelligence background. I don't know where that is coming from, because in the last exercise, the former chief of staff almost approximated and appropriated powers to himself because the president will not have his hands on the table. So for me, looking forward, we need a younger Nigerian. If you ask me, why not Bwala here? Market himself as a viable material for chief of staff.
No thanks.
He's very outspoken, at least he understands the dynamics in the country. And so he can speak to them. Because when you have a president that is hiding in the cocoon of also presidential walls, and you have a chief of staff that was also hiding, because literally, late Alhaji Abakari was literally hiding. So they said they don't have to be sane, they should be hard and all of that. What we need as a country is a chief of staff that will also be a rallying point, build harmony, understand the intricate logic of the Nigerian Federation, get across to people and personalities across all the geopolitical zones, and be able to marshal all of that into a package that will be an initiative for the president to cash in on. We have a president who doesn't speak to us, as at when due. It's almost like pushing him to speak, and when he speaks, it's almost like committing harakiri, political harakiri. And so you need a chief of staff that will understand his dynamics and be able to know exactly how much of time the president will want to speak to Nigerians. Nigerians want to see their president talk to them.
Mr. Afegbua, sorry.
The president doesn't travel to states to feel the pulse of the people. We want a chief of staff who will also be able to advise him to visit states and feel the pulse of the people.
Sorry, briefly, before we go on our first break, it's going to be another 30 seconds or so. The kind of personality of Abakari, someone who studied sociology out of this country, studied in Cambridge law, masters in Cambridge in law, went to Harvard also. How difficult is it going to be for the president? Not also forgetting the fact that is a close ally to the president, a friend of the president. How difficult is that task to get a new person for the president now?
It's not difficult. A president who has been around in the power equation of this country for over 40 years should naturally have friends he has dealt with in the past, people who he has related with, just like Abakari and all of that. But for God's sake, I don't want to be bogged down by this rhetoric of, Cambridge graduate, is a product of Cambridge, is a sociologist, is this, is that. How much of cutting-edge initiatives was Abakari able to take to influence the president to deliver on electoral promises to Nigerians? How much of policy framework were we able to see in the last 5 years since he was, before his demise? Were we able to see in the president, offering Nigerians? How much of, proactive action and steps were being taken by the president as a product of the internal workings of the chief of staff to respond to issues when they confront Nigerians in the public space? These are
let's take a break, Mr. Afegbua. Sorry,
it's not about certificates, Cambridge this, Cambridge that.
Let's take a break, Mr. Afegbua. I know you are passionate. Just tone it down a bit in the use of language, especially when we're talking about the first citizen of the land. But we'll take a break. When we come back, more analysis about the task before President Muhammadu Buhari on choosing a new chief of staff and the role that person should play, perhaps one of the most powerful political figure in the country. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us. Let's get back to the conversation. My guest tonight from our Abuja studio, Mr. Daniel Bwala, a lawyer and a social commentator, Mr. Kasim Afegbua, a public affairs analyst and a former spokesperson of the PDP Presidential Campaign Council. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming on tonight. Let's get back to the conversation, and let me come to you, Mr. Bwala. With what we have on our hands now, the role of the chief of staff has somewhat become a very key political role, which a lot of people say, look, chief of staff, at some point, you shouldn't even know really who the person is. He should just be playing his role. Have we given that office much than it naturally is?
So that's why when I started, I talked about style. Let me even correct. When I say style, I am not talking about responding promptly to issues. responding promptly or slowly is not a style. The style I'm referencing is with respect to delegation of power. And if you have noticed, like I said when I began, and it bears repeating, the office of the chief of staff is as powerful as the principal desires it to be. So the principal can reduce that office to just a mere principal secretary if he so wishes. And the president can then vest so much of power to the office of the chief of staff. Now, this president is known as one who delegates. And therefore, the man who is closest to him in government, in some cases even closer than his wife, is the office and the person who occupies the office of the chief of staff, because he is the clearinghouse for the president. Now, when we talk about loyalty, and my friend Kasim Afegbua is saying it doesn't have to follow, that chief of staff that whoever places as his own chief of staff is the person who is likely to know things that are much more secretive than even what your wife would have known. And that's why when I said it has to be somebody with background in intelligence, is because national security secrets, from secret to top secret to top secret, are domiciled and are coming in, are going out from the office of the person who runs the office as the chief of staff. And therefore, and I agree with the point, that it doesn't have to be Cambridge or anything, because Femi Fani-Kayode is from Cambridge, but it's a liability. It is not the school, it is not the qualification, it is leadership, it is the heart, it is knowledge, it is having an understanding in a nutshell of the workings of that office. And so the president, who is known as one who delegates, is looking for somebody, I believe, must look for somebody who has these qualities. The person does not have to be, like I said, a politician running for office or wanting to run for office or run for office, but he must be somebody who has a thorough understanding of government. One of the roles of the chief of staff is that, or like in the case of this president, he said it. So people who were vilifying the former chief of staff, I pray God forgive them. You have heard the president said, anything you want to communicate to me, this was when he was addressing the ministers in the second term, route it through the office of the chief of staff. It is his prerogative. It is his choice. He has a right to do that. He can choose to say route it through the office of the SGM. He can choose anyone. In this case, he chose that office. And therefore, it is critical that that office must be sensitive. And he must be somebody that the president personally knows, because he's a personal staff of the president. There is the office of the Secretary of the Government of Federation that has all the functions of managing issues relating to government. But the office of the Chief of Staff is personal. The office of the Chief of Staff is critical. In fact, the Chief of Staff must have the same characteristic that the Vice President should have, because the Chief of Staff is, on behalf of the President, discharging the duty as the President commits to his hands.
So, Mr. Afegbua, when the President, for example, said when they were having the second term resumption conversations, and he said, look, most of those who want to see him in the cabinet, the ministers and all that, should liaise with the chief of staff and pass through the communication through the chief of staff. A lot of Nigerians raised eyebrow. In that sense, do you agree with that style? Mr. Bwala has explained what he meant by the style of the president.
Well, Sheung, you see, the idea of delegated responsibility, as captured in this present presidency, is one that made the chief of staff, almost like a de facto president. And so, to that extent, the last occupant of that office became more or less like an executioner, in the power oligarchy that was captured in Aso Villa. And when you say delegated responsibility, it shouldn't be in all cases. You can delegate responsibility, fine, but you must own your government. When you say route, if you want to see me route your communication through the chief of staff, it's a given in this kind of scenario. You don't need to re-emphasize it. And re-emphasizing it means that you are officially putting it on record that when you don't see me, you see the chief of staff is as good as seeing me. And so that's why they gave him that title of a de facto president, or a surrogate president, in the last dispensation. So in this new dispensation, I want a chief of staff that has a broader and wider world view about Nigeria, and not one that is detained by nepotistic considerations or ethnic bigotry and what have you, or religious bigotry. I want a chief of staff that has an open mind, that could reach out to every segment of Nigerian population, geopolitical zones, understanding the dynamics in those zones, and being able to advise the president on the right thing to do. I wouldn't want a chief of staff that will populate a particular state with almost 70 appointees, and you want to tell me that we're in the same country. No. I want a chief of staff that will say, no, there has to be balancing in line with federal character doctrine, so that in the final analysis, they will see the country as a whole and not one that sees one as superior to the other.
Mr. Afegbua, I want to plead with you and Mr. Bwala just for a moment. Please stay with me.